Snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen marshland, each flake adding another layer to the treacherous landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The ice beneath their boots cracked with every step, revealing glimpses of black water that promised a frozen death to anyone careless enough to break through. Sergeant Reyna Hale pressed her gloved hand against the rough bark of a frost-covered pine, steadying herself as another gust of Arctic wind tore through the forest. Echo Squad had been moving through this godforsaken terrain for 6 hours, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since they'd crossed the river at dawn. Reyna's breath came out in white clouds that crystallized instantly on her scarf. Behind her, the rest of the 8-member unit trudged through knee-deep snow, their thermal signatures barely visible through the curtain of falling ice. "Command's out of their minds sending us through here," muttered Corporal Marcus Webb, the squad's communications specialist. His voice carried poorly through the wind, but Reyna heard the exhaustion in it. "This weather's only getting worse." Lieutenant Owen Price, their squad leader, raised his fist, the signal to halt. The team froze instantly, weapons raised, eyes scanning the white void around them. Reyna dropped to one knee, her custom rifle already at her shoulder, scope sweeping the tree line. Years of training had made the movement automatic, instinctive. "Something's wrong," Price said quietly into his radio. Too quiet. Reyna knew what he meant. Even in winter, a marsh this size should have some sound wind through hollow reeds, ice shifting, distant birds. But this silence felt deliberate, manufactured, like the world itself was holding its breath. She had earned her place in Echo Squad 3 years ago, after a training exercise where she'd hit a moving target at 1,800 meters in a sandstorm. The instructors had called it impossible. Reyna had simply called it Tuesday. But her reputation came with whispers she was too cold, too detached, too mechanical. They said she didn't feel fear, which made her dangerous to work with. What they didn't know was that Reyna felt everything. She just refused to let it show. 2 years ago, she'd made a mistake. A rushed shot, a miscalculation in wind speed. Her spotter, Staff Sergeant David Chen, had been exposed when she fired too early. The enemy had triangulated their position from the muzzle flash. David had died pushing her out of the kill zone, taking 3 rounds meant for her. Since then, Reyna had worked alone. No spotter, no partner, just her rifle, and the math of death at long distance. "Set up camp," Price ordered, gesturing to a cluster of pines that offered minimal shelter. "We move at 0400. Stay sharp." The squad dispersed with practiced efficiency. Reyna chose a position on the perimeter, 40 meters from the main camp, where she could watch the approaches. She cleared snow from beneath a low-hanging evergreen branch, creating a small hollow that would hide her thermal signature while giving her clear sightlines. As darkness fell, she performed her evening ritual, checking every component of her rifle, running her fingers along the barrel, testing the scope's focus. The weapon was a custom build, chambered in 338 Lapua Magnum, capable of accuracy at ranges that most snipers considered theoretical. Around 2,200 hours, Reyna noticed something, a flash of reflected light, too brief to be natural, about 800 meters northeast. She marked it mentally but didn't report it not yet. Could have been ice-catching moonlight. Could have been something else. An hour later, she heard it. A faint, metallic clink, like equipment brushing against metal. Then, another sound, almost imperceptible boots on frozen ground, but with a rhythm that didn't match any of her squad mates. Reyna keyed her radio twice the silent alert signal. In the main camp, she saw Price's head turn toward her position. She pointed northeast, held up 8 fingers, then made a circling motion. 8 contacts, surrounding them. Price's response was immediate but calm. He began quietly waking the squad, getting them into defensive positions without creating obvious movement. But Reyna knew it was already too late. The tracks in the snow around their position were days old, covered and recovered by fresh snowfall. Whoever was out there had been watching them for miles, waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect ambush point was coming at dawn. The attack came at 0547, in that gray moment before sunrise, when the world exists in shadow and the human eye struggles to distinguish shapes from darkness. Reyna was already awake, had been for hours, watching the tree line through her thermal scope when the first drone appeared. It was small, nearly silent, hovering just above the marsh grass 300 meters out. A reconnaissance drone, civilian grade, but modified, which meant their attackers were well funded, well-trained, or both. She was reaching for her radio when the marsh exploded. Smoke grenades detonated from 3 sides simultaneously, creating an instant fog bank that turned their thermal optics useless. Through the haze, Reyna heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire, not the random spray of insurgents, but the disciplined volleys of professional soldiers. "Contact front," Webb shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by explosions. Reyna rolled left as rounds tore through the pine branches above her head, showering her with frozen needles and wood chips. She low-crawled toward a fallen log, her rifle held close to her body, mind automatically calculating angles and distances even as chaos erupted around her. Through gaps in the smoke, she caught glimpses of the assault, at least 20 attackers, moving in coordinated fire teams, using the terrain with expertise that spoke of extensive training. They wore no identifying patches, but their equipment was top-tier: night vision, body armor, suppressed weapons. Echo Squad was fighting back, but they were outnumbered and caught in a kill zone. Price was shouting orders, trying to organize a fighting retreat toward higher ground, but the smoke was too thick, the enemy too close. Reyna found a shooting position behind the log and acquired her first target, a squad leader directing his team with hand signals. She put the crosshairs on his center mass, exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the man drop. But for every enemy she eliminated, 3 more appeared. They were using doctrine she recognized: Russian Special Forces tactics, modified for asymmetric warfare. An explosion to her left shook the ground. A grenade had detonated near her position, close enough that the concussive wave slammed into her like a physical blow. Her ears rang, vision blurred. She tasted copper and realized she'd bitten her tongue. Through the disorientation, she heard Webb's voice on the radio. "They're everywhere, we can't." The transmission cut off. Reyna blinked away the blood, trickling into her left eye, and raised her scope again. What she saw made her stomach drop. The smoke was clearing, and Echo Squad's positions were being overrun. Not killed, captured. The attackers were using non-lethal tactics where possible, disabling rather than executing. They wanted prisoners. She watched helplessly as Price was forced to his knees, hands zip-tied behind his back. Webb was already unconscious, being dragged toward a collection point. The rest of the squad, Martinez, Cooper, Hayes, Sullivan, Park, were all being systematically subdued and secured. Reyna started to move, to help, to do something, when the marsh beneath her gave way. The ice she'd been lying on, weakened by her body heat, and the concussive force of the grenades, cracked with a sound like breaking glass. She plunged into black water so cold it stopped her breath, shocked every nerve ending, sent her body into immediate crisis. The water was only 4 feet deep, but the mud at the bottom sucked at her legs like quicksand. She struggled upward, gasping, her rifle somehow still clutched in numb fingers. The fallen log above her had shifted, creating a natural cave of branches and ice that hid her from view. Above, she heard voices speaking in accented English. Boots crunched on ice directly overhead. 8 prisoners secured. Moving to extraction point. Confirmed. Rally at grid Echo 7. Transport ETA 20 minutes. The voices faded. The footsteps receded. And then there was only the sound of wind through frozen reeds and Reyna's own labored breathing. She was the only one who hadn't been captured. She was also alone, soaked through, in sub-zero temperatures, with no backup and no way to call for help. Webb's communications equipment was now in enemy hands. Reyna pulled herself from the water, moving with mechanical precision despite the cold that was already sapping her strength. Hypothermia would kill her in less than an hour if she didn't get dry and warm, but there was no time for that luxury. She had watched her entire squad disappear into the morning mist, and she was the only one who could bring them back. Reyna's fingers were blue when she finally managed to strip off her soaked outer layer. She was shaking so violently that it took 3 attempts to unzip her pack and pull out the emergency thermal blanket. Hypothermia wasn't just cold, it was a predator stalking her with patient inevitability. She found a hollow beneath a massive pine, where the branches had created a natural shelter, thick enough to block the wind and snow. The ground was relatively dry, covered in a bed of brown needles that had been protected from moisture. She wrapped herself in the thermal blanket and forced herself to do controlled breathing exercises, bringing her core temperature back from the edge of dangerous. The marsh spread around her like a frozen wasteland, beautiful and lethal. Every crack of ice, every gust of wind, carried the possibility of discovery or death. But more terrifying than the cold or the enemy was the silence, the absence of her squad's voices, the knowledge that 8 people who trusted her were now prisoners because she hadn't spotted the ambush in time. David's face flashed in her memory. The way he'd looked at her in that final second, before pushing her clear, knowing he was about to die. She'd failed him. Now, she'd failed Echo Squad. No, stop that thinking. Focus on what you can control. Reyna pulled out her personal optics, a high-end thermal monocular she'd bought with her own money, compact enough to survive the water. She scanned the marsh systematically, sector by sector, looking for heat signatures. There, 2 kilometers northeast, she picked up movement. Multiple figures, closely grouped, moving through the marsh in a tactical column. That had to be the enemy unit with her captured squad. They were heading deeper into hostile territory, toward what she assumed was their base of operations. She checked her rifle. The weapon had survived. The dunking military-grade rifles were designed to function after water immersion, but she'd need to field strip and dry it properly before attempting any long-range shots. That would take time she didn't have. The squad would be interrogated, possibly tortured. Every minute they remained in enemy hands decreased their chances of survival. Reyna made the calculation coldly. She could attempt to reach friendly lines, report the situation, wait for a rescue operation that might take days to organize. By then, Echo Squad would likely be dead or moved to a location impossible to track. Or she could do what she'd been trained to do: hunt. The marsh was treacherous, but it was also an ally. The enemy wouldn't expect pursuit from a single operator through this terrain. They'd be focused on moving their prisoners quickly, getting them to a secure location before command realized Echo Squad had missed their check-in. Reyna gave herself 10 minutes to dry her rifle and prepare. She worked with the efficiency of long practice, breaking down the weapon, clearing every component, reassembling with hands that had stopped shaking. She changed into her one set of dry underlayers, sacrificing warmth for the flexibility she'd need. Her ammunition count: 32 rounds of 338 Lapua Magnum against 20-plus enemy combatants. The math wasn't in her favor. But math had never stopped her before. She began tracking, moving through the marsh with the patience of someone who understood that speed without stealth was just suicide with extra steps. The enemy had left a trail boot prints in snow, disturbed ice, broken vegetation. They were moving fast, prioritizing speed over concealment, confident that no pursuit would come through this frozen hellscape. They were wrong. After 90 minutes of careful tracking, Reyna found an elevated position, a rocky outcrop that rose about 50 meters above the marsh floor. It was exposed, windswept, and absolutely the worst place a rational sniper would choose for a hide. The gusts here were chaotic, swirling, impossible to predict with any consistency. But it was also the only position within 3 kilometers that offered a clear line of sight to where the enemy was taking her squad. Through her scope, at maximum magnification, she could see them. A cleared area near an old ranger station, now converted into a temporary holding facility. The prisoners were being held in what looked like a reinforced storage building. Guards patrolled the perimeter, more clustered near vehicles. Reyna pulled out her rangefinder and took a reading. 2,897 meters, nearly 3 kilometers. She had made successful shots at 2,200 meters before. The longest confirmed sniper kill in history was just over 3,500 meters, made by a Canadian Special Forces operator with ideal conditions and multiple spotters. Reyna had neither ideal conditions nor spotters. She had brutal crosswinds, falling snow, sub-freezing temperatures that would affect her ballistics, and the knowledge that her squad would die if she didn't try. She began her calculations. The enemy's trail through the marsh told a story for those trained to read it. Reyna moved parallel to their path, staying in cover, studying every detail with the analytical mind that had made her one of the Army's top-rated snipers. They were a professional unit, that much was clear. Their spacing was textbook, 5 meters between individuals, staggered formation to avoid presenting clustered targets. When they'd crossed areas of thin ice, they'd moved in single file, each soldier stepping in the exact footprints of the one ahead to distribute weight. But they'd made mistakes. Small ones, the kind that only mattered if someone was actually tracking them through this frozen wasteland, which they clearly hadn't expected. One of their soldiers had a damaged boot, the left heel showing a distinctive crack that left an identifiable mark. Another walked with a slight limp, compensating by pushing harder with his right leg, creating an uneven depth in the snow. These details gave Reyna a way to confirm she was following the right unit, not just random movements through the marsh. She found the spot where they'd stopped to regroup, a cluster of trees, where boot prints overlapped and cigarette butts were scattered in the snow. They'd been confident enough to take a smoke break, which told her they felt secure in this territory. The tracks led steadily northeast, toward higher ground where the marsh gave way to dense pine forest. Reyna followed with the patience of a predator, placing each step carefully, using terrain features to mask her movement. Years of training had taught her to become part of the landscape, invisible not through technology but through understanding of light, shadow, and human perception. As she moved, she constantly evaluated potential shooting positions. A sniper's mind was always calculating angles, distances, wind effects, concealment, escape routes. Every piece of terrain was assessed for tactical value. Most of the high ground was too close to the enemy's path. Any shot from there would give away her position immediately and make escape impossible. She needed distance, needed the kind of range where even the sound of her rifle shot would take seconds to reach the target, giving her time to reposition. That's when she spotted it. The rocky outcrop, jutting from the marsh like a broken tooth. It was exposed, visible for kilometers, completely indefensible if the enemy came looking for her. No experienced sniper would choose it, which was exactly why it might work. Reyna climbed carefully, testing each handhold, moving with the slow precision of someone who understood that a twisted ankle meant death in this environment. The wind grew stronger as she ascended, howling between the rocks with a sound like distant screaming. At the summit, she found a relatively flat shelf of stone, large enough to lie prone with her rifle. The position offered an unobstructed view of the entire valley below. Through her scope, she could see the old ranger station clearly. Every building, every vehicle, every guard position. She pulled out her rangefinder and took multiple readings, confirming what her instincts had already told her. 2,900 meters. Nearly 1.8 miles. At that distance, her bullet would take approximately 4 seconds to reach the target. The round would drop nearly 30 meters from the bore line. A crosswind of just 5 miles per hour would push the bullet over a meter off course. And the wind here wasn't 5 miles per hour, it was gusting between 15 and 30, changing direction randomly. Any military manual would classify this shot as impossible. But Reyna had learned long ago that impossible just meant no one's done it yet. She began her preparations. Reyna's hands were bare as she assembled her shooting position, despite the cold that made her fingers ache. She needed to feel everything, the texture of the rock, the vibration of wind, the exact pressure points where her rifle would rest. Gloves dulled sensation, and at 2,900 meters, even the smallest variable could mean the difference between a clean hit and a complete miss. She arranged stones carefully, creating a stable platform that would absorb recoil without shifting. The rifle needed to be perfectly level, perfectly supported. Any cant, even a fraction of a degree, would send the bullet wildly off target at this distance. Next came the most critical task, reading the wind. At normal combat ranges, wind was a manageable variable. But at 3 kilometers, wind became the primary factor determining success or failure. The problem was that wind wasn't consistent. It varied by altitude, by terrain, by the temperature gradients between ground and air. Reyna pulled out a small notebook, worn from years of use, and began recording observations. She watched snowflakes fall, noting how they drifted and swirled. She studied the movement of branches in the valley below, seeing how trees at different elevations swayed with different rhythms. Professional snipers used wind meters, weather stations, ballistic computers. Reyna had her eyes, her experience, and a technique she'd learned from an old Marine Corps instructor who'd served in Vietnam. She plucked several strands of her own hair and held them up, feeling how they moved in the wind. Hair was sensitive enough to detect even subtle air currents. She tied the strands to small stones and placed them at different positions around her shooting platform, creating a crude but effective wind detection system. Then she began to breathe. Slow, controlled breaths that lowered her heart rate. bringing her body into the state she thought of as the calm. Her pulse dropped from its normal 60 beats per minute down to 50, then 45. The world seemed to slow, sounds becoming distant, vision narrowing to perfect clarity. This was the trance state that only the best snipers could achieve, a place where the body and mind worked together with mechanical precision, where training and instinct merged into something that looked like intuition but was actually the result of 10,000 hours of practice. Her heart rate settled at 44 beats per minute. Perfect. Through her scope, she studied the ranger station in detail. Guards changed position every 15 minutes, standard protocol. The prisoners were being held in the main building, visible through windows when guards opened the door. She counted heads. All 8 members of Echo Squad accounted for. But there was a problem. The shots she needed to make weren't just difficult, they required a sequence. She'd need to eliminate the immediate threat to her squad, which meant identifying who was in command, who had his finger on a trigger pointed at her people. At 2,900 meters, she couldn't see faces clearly, but she could see body language, posture, the way other soldiers deferred to certain individuals. There, a man in the center of the compound, pointing, giving orders. That was the commander. If she could take him out first, the chaos might give her squad a chance to act. But there was something else she needed to consider. David. The memory came unbidden, as it always did when she was preparing for a critical shot. David's voice in her ear, steady and calm, calling corrections. Wind left to right, estimate 8 clicks. Target moving, lead by 1 meter. She'd had a spotter then, someone to catch the variables she missed, to confirm her calculations, to share the immense responsibility of taking a human life at long distance. Now, she was alone. Reyna pulled out her ballistic data book and began calculating. Bullet drop at 2,900 meters with her specific ammunition load, 29.7 meters. Coriolis effect. The rotation of the Earth would actually deflect her bullets slightly, 8 centimeters to the right at this latitude. Temperature was -15 Celsius, which would slow the bullet's muzzle velocity by approximately 20 feet per second. She worked through the math with mechanical precision, double-checking every calculation. Then she made adjustments to her scope, dialing in elevation and windage based on her best estimates. The wind was the variable she couldn't fully predict. It would change between the moment she fired and the moment the bullet arrived. She'd need to make her best guess and trust her instincts. Through the scope, she saw movement at the ranger station. Guards were assembling the prisoners outside. This was wrong. Why move them? Unless they were about to transport them to a more secure location. Or execute them. Reyna's pulse spiked, threatening her calm. She breathed deeply, forcing the panic down. Getting emotional now would make the shot impossible. She had one chance. 4 seconds of bullet flight, 2,900 meters of uncertainty, and 8 lives depending on her making the most difficult shot of her career. She settled into position, cheek welded to the stock, eye aligned perfectly with the scope. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, feeling the slight resistance of the mechanism. The world narrowed to a tunnel of perfect focus. And then, for exactly 4 seconds, the wind stopped. The silence was absolute. No wind, no falling snow, just crystalline stillness that stretched across the frozen marsh like a held breath. Reyna had learned to recognize these moments, brief gaps in the chaos where the atmosphere itself seemed to pause. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5 at most. Through her scope, magnified to maximum, the target was clear. The enemy commander standing in the center of the compound, gesturing toward the prisoners who were being lined up against a wall. The posture, the body language. Reyna had seen execution preparations before. Her crosshairs settled on center mass. At 2,900 meters, attempting a headshot would be pure gambling. The torso offered a larger margin for error, though margin was relative when the target was smaller than a fingernail in her scope. She had already made every calculation possible. Now came the part that couldn't be calculated, the part that separated adequate snipers from legendary ones. Intuition. Reyna exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs until she reached that perfect moment between breaths where the body was absolutely still. Her heart beat exactly once more. She could feel it. A slow thud in her chest, and then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, the recoil pushing back against her shoulder, the muzzle blast echoing off the rocks around her. Through the scope, she kept her eye on the target, watching, waiting. 1 second. The bullet was still climbing, arcing upward to clear the maximum ordinate of its trajectory. 2 seconds. The round was at its apex, beginning its descent, traveling at still over 1,200 feet per second. 3 seconds. The bullet was dropping fast now, fighting gravity and air resistance, the 338 Lapua Magnum round cutting through the cold air. 4 seconds. The commander dropped like a puppet with cut strings. For a moment, nobody in the compound reacted. They didn't understand what had happened. The sound of the rifle shot wouldn't reach them for another 3 seconds, and even then, it would be impossible to determine direction. The echoes off the marsh would scatter the sound in every direction. One guard looked down at the fallen commander, confused. Another guard turned, scanning the area, and then the sound arrived, a distant crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Chaos erupted. Reyna was already working her bolt, chambering a second round. She'd planned for this. The enemy would scatter, taking cover, trying to understand where the threat was coming from. But she had a few more seconds of confusion to exploit. Her second target, the guard closest to Lieutenant Price, the one with his rifle pointed at the prisoners. Through the scope, she saw him turning, trying to process what was happening. She fired again. Another 4-second eternity. Another impossible calculation made in the space between heartbeats. The guard went down. Now, the compound was in full panic. Soldiers were running, some toward cover, others trying to drag the prisoners back inside the building. But 3 of them, she could see it clearly through her scope, had grabbed their own weapons and were making a break for it. Martinez, Cooper, and Hayes. They'd recognized the opportunity and taken it. Reyna shifted her aim, tracking a third target, an enemy soldier who'd found cover and was drawing a bead on the escaping prisoners. She led the target slightly, accounting for his movement, and fired. Miss. The wind had shifted, just a breath, but enough to push her shot wide. She worked the bolt, chambered another round. The soldier was still aiming. She adjusted, squeezed. The soldier dropped his rifle and collapsed. 4 shots fired. 3 hits at 2,900 meters. A success rate that would seem impossible to anyone who didn't understand that impossible was just another word for difficult. But now, the enemy was adapting. She saw soldiers setting up a heavy machine gun, pointing it in the general direction of her position. They couldn't see her, she was too far away, too well concealed, but they were going to spray fire toward the high ground. The first burst from the machine gun sent rounds cracking past her position, striking rocks 50 meters to her left. They were guessing, but even a guess could get lucky. Reyna took one more shot, this one at a fuel truck in the compound. She'd noticed it earlier, marked it as a potential target. The 338 Lapua Magnum round wasn't an incendiary, but at this distance, it would punch through the thin metal of the tank. The truck exploded in a fireball that sent soldiers diving for cover and created enough smoke to obscure the entire compound. In the confusion, the rest of Echo Squad made their move. Reyna watched through her scope as Price led the remaining prisoners in a coordinated breakout, using the smoke as concealment. They were moving toward the marsh, toward the network of frozen waterways that would make them almost impossible to track. She'd done her part. Now it was time to do something even more difficult. Survive long enough to link back up with them. Because the enemy was coming for her now. She could see them forming a pursuit team, grabbing cold weather gear and weapons. They knew approximately where the shots had come from, and they were pissed. Reyna began breaking down her shooting position, working with practiced speed. The exposed outcrop that had given her the perfect shooting platform was now a death trap. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached her. Time to move. Reyna descended the outcrop with controlled urgency, testing each foothold before committing her weight. A fall now would be catastrophic. Broken bones in this cold meant death, and she couldn't help her squad if she was crippled or dead. She'd made it about 30 meters down when the first bullet started hitting the rocks above her. The enemy had thermal optics and had picked up her heat signature. They were still too far for accurate fire, maybe 800 meters out, but they were closing fast. She dropped the last 10 feet, landing in deep snow that cushioned her fall but also slowed her movement. The marsh here was a nightmare of hidden ice shelves and deep water pockets. She could see the enemy's approach reflected in her knowledge of the terrain. They'd have to navigate the same obstacles, which bought her time, but not much. Reyna moved laterally, putting distance between herself and the obvious escape route. Most people, when fleeing, ran in a straight line away from pursuit. She angled perpendicular, heading toward an area of broken ice and standing water that would be treacherous to cross. Treacherous meant dangerous for everyone. That was the point. She reached the ice field and paused, reading the surface. The darker patches were thin ice or open water. The white areas were solid probably. At her weight, with careful movement, she might make it across. The enemy, rushing in pursuit, would be less careful. She started across, testing each step, spreading her weight. Behind her, she heard shouts they'd reached the ice field and were deciding how to proceed. One of them was impatient. She heard the ice crack, heard the splash, heard cursing in Russian, followed by panicked calls for help. One down, by his own mistake. The others would be more careful now, which meant slower. Good. Reyna reached solid ground on the far side and immediately moved to a position where she could observe the ice field. She needed to keep them cautious, keep them slow. Every minute she bought was another minute for Echo Squad to increase their lead. She found cover behind a fallen tree, set up her rifle, and waited. Through her scope, she watched 4 soldiers carefully making their way across the ice, weapons ready, moving in tactical bounds. Professional, disciplined, dangerous. She selected the lead soldier, the one others were following, trusting his path across the ice. She aimed not at him, but at the ice directly in front of him. The 338 Lapua Magnum would punch through the ice, maybe compromise its integrity. She fired. The ice in front of the lead soldier exploded in a shower of fragments. He jerked back instinctively, stumbled, and his weight shifted onto his rear foot. The ice beneath him cracked with a sound like breaking glass. He went through. The other 3 soldiers froze, suddenly realizing that their pursuit had become a minefield. They couldn't advance without risking the same fate. They couldn't retreat without showing their backs to her. Reyna took advantage of their indecision. She put a round into the ice near the second soldier, not trying to hit him, just making the ice around him fracture. He scrambled backward, terror overriding training. Now, they were retreating, dragging their half-frozen comrade from the water, focused on survival rather than pursuit. But Reyna knew this respite was temporary. They'd regroup, find a safer route, and come at her with more numbers and better tactics. She needed to link up with Echo Squad before that happened. She pulled out her compass and oriented herself toward the direction she'd seen her squad heading northeast, deeper into the marsh, toward a series of low hills that offered better defensive positions. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that reduced visibility but also covered her tracks. She moved with purpose, following game trails when she found them, using terrain features to mask her heat signature from aerial observation. After 40 minutes of hard movement, she found it. A set of boot prints in fresh snow, 8 sets, moving in tactical formation. Echo Squad was staying together, staying disciplined. Good. She followed their trail, catching up quickly now that she knew where they were heading. As she moved, she prepared for the next phase. These soldiers hunting her squad wouldn't give up. They'd suffered casualties, lost prisoners, been embarrassed by a single operator. They'd want revenge. And they'd bring everything they had. Reyna needed to be ready to give Echo Squad what they needed most, time and covering fire. She checked her ammunition. 19 rounds remaining, against potentially 15 or more enemy combatants. The math still wasn't in her favor, but she was getting used to that. Reyna found Echo Squad, 3 kilometers northeast of the ranger station, holed up in a natural depression surrounded by dense pines. They'd chosen their position well, good visibility of approaches, cover from above, multiple escape routes if needed. She announced herself before entering their perimeter, using the daily password in case anyone was jumpy with a trigger finger. Lieutenant Price's face showed pure relief when she materialized from the snow like a ghost. "Sergeant Hale," he said, gripping her shoulder. That was one hell of a rescue. The squad was in rough shape. Martinez had a badly sprained ankle from the escape. Cooper had taken a glancing blow to his shoulder, not life-threatening but painful. All of them showed signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. "We need to move," Reyna said, not wasting time on reunions. "They're regrouping for pursuit. We have maybe 30 minutes before they're on us." "Can't move fast with Martinez," Webb said, helping support the injured man. "And Cooper's not much better." "Then we make them pay for every meter they gain on us," Price decided. "Hale, you're our best asset right now. What do you need?" "Time to set up defensive positions along our route," Reyna replied. If I can slow them down, pick off their scouts, we might make it to the extraction point. The extraction point was a clearing 6 kilometers north, where a helicopter could potentially land if they could call one in, and if the weather held. Both were uncertain propositions. They began moving, with Reyna ranging ahead as advance scout. Every few hundred meters, she'd find a position where she could observe their back trail, wait to see if pursuit appeared, and engage if necessary. The enemy was cautious now, having learned the cost of underestimating their prey. But they were still coming. She could see them through her scope, moving in a extended line, using proper tactical spacing. She let them close to 600 meters, then took a shot at their point man. The soldier went down, and the entire line went to ground. They'd stay put for several minutes, trying to locate her position before resuming their advance. Reyna moved before they could triangulate where her shot came from. Another 500 meters up the trail, another position, another shot. This time she aimed for equipment. She hit a soldier's radio pack, destroying their communications gear without killing the man. Psychological warfare was as effective as body count. The pattern continued for 2 hours. Reyna would move ahead, find a hide, engage at long range, then displace before return fire could find her. Each engagement bought Echo Squad precious minutes, pushed them closer to salvation. But the marsh was fighting them too. The route to the extraction point crossed several areas of thin ice, places where the water never fully froze even in winter. They had to move in single file, testing each step, moving with agonizing slowness while their pursuers gained ground. At one point, young Private Hayes, barely 19 years old, broke through the ice up to his chest. The shock of the cold water made him gasp and panic, thrashing, which only made things worse. Reyna reached him first, dropping prone to distribute her weight, extending her rifle stock for him to grab. "Stop moving," she commanded, her voice cutting through his panic. "Look at me. Stop moving." He froze, wide eyes locked on hers. "Breathe slowly. Spread your arms on the ice. You're not sinking, the water's only 4 feet deep. Feel the bottom with your feet." She saw him process this, saw the panic ease slightly as his feet found solid ground beneath the water. "Now push with your legs and pull yourself toward me. Slow, controlled. You're going to be fine." It took 2 minutes of careful effort, but they got him out. He was soaked, shaking, but alive. They wrapped him in an emergency blanket and kept moving. Stopping meant death for all of them. Finally, as twilight approached, they reached a defensive position that Price declared good enough. It was a small hill crowned with boulders, offering 360-degree visibility and multiple layers of cover. If they had to make a stand, this was as good as it would get. "Call for extraction," Price ordered Webb, who'd recovered a backup radio from his gear. Webb tried every frequency, every emergency channel. Nothing but static. "Storm's interfering," he reported. "Or they're jamming us. Either way, we're not getting air support tonight." Price absorbed this news with visible frustration. "Then we dig in and survive till morning. Set watch rotation. Hale, I want you on overwatch with full autonomy. If you see a threat, engage at your discretion." As darkness fell and temperature plummeted to -20 Celsius, Reyna found her position among the boulders and settled in for what would be the longest night of her life. Because the enemy was still out there. And they weren't giving up. They came at 0200, in the coldest, darkest hours when human vigilance was at its lowest ebb. Reyna spotted them, first thermal signatures moving through the trees, at least 12 contacts, advancing in a coordinated assault formation. "Contact," she said quietly into her radio. "Multiple hostiles, 300 meters, moving to assault positions." Echo Squad came alert instantly, years of training overriding exhaustion. Price had arranged them in a defensive circle, each person responsible for a sector, overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook defensive doctrine, but with only 8 soldiers against a dozen or more attackers, the math was still ugly. Reyna had spent the last hour setting surprises along the likely approach routes. Nothing fancy, just some tripwires connected to tin cans filled with rocks, some pressure triggers made from sticks and cord. The goal wasn't to kill but to alert and slow. The first makeshift alarm went off at 280 meters, a soft clatter of rocks that signaled the enemy's advance. Reyna tracked the sound's origin through her scope, found the heat signature, took a breath, fired. One down. The enemy immediately went prone, but they didn't retreat. These were professionals who'd been humiliated once today and weren't going to let it happen again. They began a methodical advance under covering fire, using proper infantry tactics. The battle became a series of sharp exchanges, bursts of automatic fire lighting up the night, tracers cutting through falling snow like lethal fireflies, the crack of Reyna's rifle answered by the heavier thump of return fire against the boulders protecting her. She worked her rifle with mechanical precision, picking targets carefully, making every shot count. At these ranges, 200 to 400 meters, she was lethal, and the enemy knew it. They started focusing suppressive fire on her position, trying to keep her head down while other elements maneuvered. But Reyna had learned long ago how to work through incoming fire. You never completely ignored it, that was how you died, but you trained yourself to assess which rounds were actually dangerous and which were just noise. Most suppressive fire was just that, noise. She took 3 more targets in quick succession, and the enemy assault stalled. They'd expected to overrun a position held by exhausted, demoralized prisoners. Instead, they'd run into a prepared defense anchored by a sniper who seemed to see in the dark and never missed. Their commander, whoever had taken over after Reyna killed the first one, made a tactical decision. She saw it happening through her scope, soldiers pulling back, regrouping, changing tactics. They were bringing up a marksman of their own. The first shot from the enemy sniper came so close that Reyna heard the supersonic crack of the bullet passing inches from her head. Professional-grade shooting, someone who knew their business. She immediately rolled left, changing position, putting a boulder between herself and the likely direction of fire. A second shot hit exactly where she'd been, spraying rock chips. This was different now. This was sniper versus sniper, the oldest and most personal form of combat. Reyna forced herself to slow down, to think. The enemy marksman had to be using thermal optics, same as her. He'd seen her muzzle flash, tracked her movement. He was probably expecting her to pop up in a different position for a countershot, so she didn't. Instead, she waited, patient, letting minutes tick by, letting him wonder if he'd hit her, or if she was maneuvering for a flank shot. Behind her, Echo Squad maintained suppressive fire, keeping the enemy infantry from advancing, but ammunition was finite, and the enemy seemed willing to trade rounds indefinitely. After 5 minutes, Reyna saw what she'd been waiting for. A brief thermal bloom, about 400 meters out, elevated position. The enemy sniper shifting his weight, adjusting his scope. She put her crosshairs on the heat signature and waited. He'd move again, they always did when they thought they'd been spotted. There. A subtle shift. Reyna fired. Through her scope, she saw the thermal signature collapse. The enemy sniper was down. The effect on the enemy assault was immediate and devastating. Without their precision shooter, they'd lost a critical asset. Their fire became less coordinated, their movements more hesitant. Price seized the moment. Suppressive fire, all sectors, drive them back. Echo Squad opened up with everything they had, a concentrated wall of fire that any rational enemy would retreat from. And these enemies were rational. They'd taken heavy casualties for zero gain. They began pulling back, dragging wounded, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. But Reyna knew this wasn't victory. It was just a reprieve. Come daylight, the enemy would either assault with overwhelming force or simply call in artillery or air support. Echo Squad needed extraction, and they needed it before sunrise. As if reading her thoughts, Webb suddenly called out, "I've got signal. Patchy, but I've got signal." "Request immediate extraction," Price shouted. "Emergency priority." They waited in tense silence while Webb worked the radio, praying the signal would hold long enough to get their message through. "They copy," Webb finally announced. "Helicopters inbound, ETA 45 minutes. Weather's breaking enough for them to fly." 45 minutes. They had to hold for 45 more minutes. The enemy would know that sound traveled far in cold air. They'd hear the helicopters coming. They'd make one last push to prevent the extraction. "Everyone check ammunition," Price ordered. "This is about to get real." Reyna had 6 rounds left in her magazine, 6 bullets between Echo Squad and whatever final assault the enemy was planning. She'd made impossible shots before. She just hoped she had a few more impossible left in her. The helicopters came in low and fast, skimming just above the tree line, their rotors creating a downwash that threw up clouds of snow and frozen debris. two Black Hawks, armed and angry, their door guns already tracking for threats. The enemy made their final play exactly as Reyna had predicted. They emerged from the tree line in a desperate assault, knowing this was their last chance to prevent the extraction. But now they were silhouetted against the morning sky, and Echo Squad was fighting with the desperate energy of people who could see salvation arriving. Reyna took her last 6 shots carefully, methodically, dropping 6 targets in a perfect rhythm that her instructors would have applauded. Then her rifle clicked empty, and she transitioned to her pistol, providing covering fire while the helicopters touched down. "Move! Move! Move!" Price was shouting, coordinating the evacuation even as rounds kicked up snow around the landing zone. The door gunners opened up, their heavy machine guns laying down suppressive fire that finally broke the enemy assault. Soldiers scrambled aboard the helicopters, Martinez and Cooper lifted bodily by their squad mates, Hayes still wrapped in his emergency blanket, everyone moving with the frantic energy of those who'd accepted they were going to die and then been given an unexpected reprieve. "Hale, move!" Price was the last one standing outside the helicopter, refusing to board until his entire squad was accounted for. Reyna ran, her legs burning with exhaustion, her lungs aching from the cold air. She dove through the helicopter door just as the pilot pulled pitch, lifting them away from the kill zone. Below, the marsh receded, that frozen wasteland that had nearly become her grave now just a white expanse, marked with the dark scars of combat. She could see the enemy soldiers regrouping, staring up at the departing helicopters, knowing they'd lost. Inside the Black Hawk, Echo Squad was checking each other over, confirming everyone had made it, dealing with the shock and relief of survival. Someone handed Reyna a bottle of water, someone else draped a blanket over her shoulders. Price sat down next to her, had to lean close to be heard over the rotor noise. "That shot from 3 kilometers out, I didn't think it was possible." "It wasn't," Reyna replied honestly. "Statistically speaking, I should have missed. Wind was wrong, conditions were wrong, everything was wrong. But you made it anyway." 3 times. 3 hits at 2,900 meters. Price shook his head in amazement. "They're going to want a full debrief. The ballistics people are going to lose their minds. That might be one of the longest confirmed sniper kills ever recorded." Reyna didn't respond. She was looking out the open door at the marsh below, thinking about David, thinking about all the shots she'd missed, all the mistakes she'd made, and thinking about the 8 people in this helicopter who were alive because she'd made 3 shots that everyone would have said were impossible. Webb leaned over, grinning despite his exhaustion. "They're already calling it in on the command net. Silent Frost. That's what they're calling you, the Silent Frost Sniper." "That's stupid," Reyna said, but without heat. "That's military nicknames," Webb replied. "Be glad it's not something worse." As the helicopter carried them toward safety, toward hot showers and warm food and medical care, Reyna felt something shift inside her. The weight she'd carried since David's death, the guilt, the self-imposed isolation, the belief that she was too dangerous to work with others began to ease. She hadn't saved David, but she'd saved Echo Squad. Sometimes, redemption didn't come from making up for past failures. Sometimes, it came from simply being there when it mattered, being ready when the impossible became necessary. The sun broke through the clouds ahead, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and lethal, like everything in this frozen wasteland. Price touched her shoulder, gestured to the squad. "You know what you did back there? You gave us something no one else could. Hope. When we were tied up in that compound, when we thought we were dead, you gave us hope that we'd survive." Reyna looked at the faces around her. Martinez, Cooper, Hayes, Sullivan, Park, Webb, Price. 8 people who'd trusted her. 8 people who'd survived, because she'd refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. "Just doing my job, sir," she said quietly. "No," Price replied. "You did something better than your job. You did the impossible." The helicopter banked toward the rising sun, carrying them home, carrying them away from the frozen marsh and the silent forest, and all the places where death had seemed certain. Behind them, the killing ground faded into white. Ahead, the future waited. And somewhere in between, Reyna Hale, the soldier they'd once called too cold to fight, had become the Silent Frost Sniper, the woman who'd made the impossible shot when it mattered most. The one who'd been alone in the frozen dark. The one who'd refused to let her squad die. The one who'd hit a target at 2,900 meters in a winter storm and saved 8 lives with 3 bullets and 4 seconds of stillness. In the marsh below, the snow would cover the battlefield, erasing the evidence of combat, burying the blood and the shell casings and the frozen boot prints. But the story would remain. And that story would spread through every military base, every training facility, every sniper school, becoming the legend that instructors would tell to students who insisted that certain shots were impossible. The story of the Silent Frost sniper. The story of Reyna Hale, who'd proven that impossible just meant no one had done it yet. Until now.